Hi everybody, Kristen with Woollypetals here, and I am going to demonstrate how to make multiple HSTs at a time. So, HST, you are all here, so you probably know what an HST is, a half square triangle. And I typically make my HSTs 2 at a time, which is 2 squares, one of each color, and right sides together, marked with a diagonal line down corner to corner and sewn a 1/4 inch away on each side. And then you cut it apart on the line and you open it up. Probably is a little bit bigger than you want it, so you trim it down to size. I love a black lock ruler for that, just FYI. And I have a spitting cutting mat that works really great. Mine is getting a little bit bowed. So I recently watched a video where somebody demonstrated how to do 16 at a time of a certain size of HST. And while I don't use more than 2 at a time super often because I like this method for super scrappy, some patterns, for instance, my New Star beginner quilt pattern, this is it. This is the cover quilt. So this pattern does have multiple HSTs of the same fabric combination, and you can play around with it and do it however you like. But in the pattern, because it's written for beginners, I do actually just do 2 at a time, but I did want to share this video to help you in case you are doing multiple at a time. So you could do this method for that pattern or any other pattern that you need to do multiple HSTs at a time of the same fabric. In order to do that, you have to make some sort of a grid. Now, this grid can be expanded or shrunk to make however many HSTs at a time you want to make. So for instance, if this is your squares, if this is your single square HST, this whole fabric shown here is one fabric, and then it'll be right sides together with a second fabric. So let's say this ends up being your just 2 at a time HSTs. If you did that one, let's cover up this other section here and focus on this. So this is your 2 at a time HST. 2 squares right side together, draw a diagonal line, and you stitch a 1/4 inch away on either side of that line, cut it apart, right? So the next you could do is 4 at a time, and that would be cutting a rectangle out of both your fabrics, again, right sides together. You would actually draw at the center point. You could draw this line just so you know for cutting, but you don't have to draw that line. You probably will need to draw those grid lines as you get more and more. This would be 4 at a time HSTs. So you would actually want to draw from this top quarter of your rectangle to the middle in a point and then back down to the opposite corner. And again, you would sew a 1/4 inch away from that line and then this line. And then when you're done sewing, you're going to cut it apart on those diagonal lines and this center line here. That's what that center line is here for. And that will give you 4 HSTs. We want to go a step farther. So you could go up to 6 HSTs at a time and do an even taller rectangle. Again, 2 fabrics, right sides together. You would draw these angled lines and sew a 1/4 inch away on either side of the angled lines. After it's sewn, you would cut it apart and cut it down the marked lines. So that's 6 at a time if you really want to do that method. Now, if you want to go to up to 8 at a time, let's do a square. You're going to cut a square. This would be a good time, I would say, mark this grid. And I actually just use a pencil because that's where you're cutting and you're going to trim those off. You could use a fabric marker or fabric pen as well. You're going to draw this grid halfway, so it's an X, and then you're going to connect those X's with your diagonal line, and you're going to sew the 1/4 inch on either side of that line, just like before. When you do this middle section, this middle line to the inside, you're going to go from this line to this line to that line and to that line and back and pivot at the lines. And then again, when you're all sewn, both sides of these 4 diagonal lines, you're going to cut the squares apart and then you're going to cut down those diagonal lines. You could expand to 12 at a time. So you're adding a 3rd set of squares, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right sides together with your other piece of fabric. So this is the fabric. You're just cutting out this outer section of fabric. And then you're drawing this grid and drawing these diagonal lines. And then you're doing the same thing, a 1/4 inch on the diagonal line on either side. And then you cut out on these diagonal lines and on the grid. So as you can see, you can keep expanding this. This would be 16 at a time. You could continue going. I've done 20 at a time is the most I've done by adding another square out here. And then basically you're continuing these diagonal lines up. You can go up. So if we go up, we're going to have 24 at a time. And you could continue going up and out as wide or as tall as your fabric. You just need to draw this grid and then draw these diagonal lines connecting just like this and then expanding the pattern going up. So the trick with this is you can do this for any size HST you need. These squares are going to be drawn and cut at the size you would normally make for any HST 2 at a time. Does that make sense? So if you want a 3.5 inch cut HST, so that's after you trim it. Typically, I think most people cut their squares to make 2 at a time, 3.5 inch cut HSTs. They'll cut their squares at between 4 inches square and 4.25 inches square. So now I would say, side note, if you are very, very good at drawing these grid lines and staying 1/4 inch away, just do a 4 inch grid. This is a 4 inch square. If you are, so that's adding 1/2 inch to your cut size. If you are not super great at that, maybe adding an extra 1/8 to 1/4 inch would be beneficial. I'm not too bad, and there were a few that as I'm sewing might have gotten a little bit bigger, or as I'm trimming I did not have hardly any to trim and I did 1/2 inch bigger. So to recap, these squares that you're drawing on your piece of fabric are the size you would cut the square for 2 at a time HSTs. So if we're doing 1/2 inch bigger and we want to finish at 3.5 inches trimmed down like these, we are going to cut 4 inch squares, but we're not going to cut these squares out. We're going to lay out our grid, and you can draw it on paper like this just so you know before you draw on the fabric. So you would lay out your grid 4, 8, 12, 16 inches wide, 4, 8, 12 inches tall. And then I would cut out a rectangle that size from both my fabrics. On one of my fabrics, I would draw these lines just like this, or if you're going bigger, you're going to calculate that. You could go 16 by 16 and do 32 at a time. Like, there are really no limits to this aside from the size of your fabric. You could continue going out to the side. You could go up. So let's say you want 2.5 inch trimmed HSTs. If you are at 1/2 inch for your 2 at a time, you're going to make these squares 3 inches. So 3, 6, 9, 12, 3, 6, 9. So you're going to make a 12 by 9 rectangle out of both fabrics and draw the same pattern. So basically, whatever amount you're doing, you're going to draw this grid. If you're making your grid bigger, you're going to just keep drawing it bigger, and you're going to be expanding these diamonds just how they're just kind of repeating that diamond pattern. So then you can continue sewing all the way up on both sides. The only thing is when you're sewing inside these lines, we do pivot at that line. It's just a little bit easier to cut through. That's your seam line. So I could continue just going up and up and up. I could do only 2 wide and go up and up and up. I could do 3 wide and go up and up and up. Every square here represents 2 HSTs. So for any size you are making, you are going to add that 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch to make it a little bit bigger so you can trim down, and you're going to make these grid squares that size. So I'm going to demonstrate on this piece. Let's do this exact before we added this extra one. Let's do 24 at a time. I am using these fabrics to make HST fabric to make a quilt coat and a bag. So I need a lot of HSTs out of one fabric. If, say, I was doing the New Star quilt like this, I would see how many do I need of the background fabric plus blue or the background fabric plus purple. I need 40 of each, and I might even draw out a grid that would get me 40 at a time because why not, right? Okay, so we're going to do this exact grid. 4 squares by 3 squares. My squares are going to measure, I'm going to try 4 1/4 inches this time. Last time I did 4-inch squares, like I said, and some of mine when I trim are getting really close, and I would like to trim off slightly more. So I'm going to make this, oops, sorry, I'm covering that up so I know we're not doing that. 4 1/4, 8 1/2, and then because that's half, we have 8 1/2 plus 8 1/2. So 17 inches wide, and 4 1/4, 8 1/2, 12 3/4 inches tall. Those are what I'm cutting my rectangles at. Okay, so let's set this aside. I'm going to keep my eye on these dimensions so I don't forget. I have my fabrics laid out on top of each other here. I'm probably actually going to flip that back and cut one at a time since I'm cutting them not the full width of my fabric. This is a time when, if you've watched my cutting videos for New Star or you're a seasoned quilter, you know I have this registration line across my fabric. I'm going to cut up from that registration cut line to smooth out this side, slash I'm going to cut down because of the angle. So we can actually just chop that off. I am going to have to use my cutting mat to measure this. I don't have a large enough ruler to just cut it in one fell swoop. So I'm going to come down to the 0 mark line and align both my registration cuts on my cutting mat. I have found with this method, with the grids, because you have to draw these lines and then you're going to stitch next to the lines, I have found being a little generous with your cut, so going slightly past 12 3/4 or slightly past 17 so that you can account for the thickness of your ruler works very nice. So I need 12 1/4. So 36, 6 inches is here, and then 6 inches is here, so 3/4, and then I need 17 wide. So I'm marking my 17 there, and I'm going to align it with the 12 3/4 mark, and I'm going to cut across and then down, move my ruler, and finish that cut. So I'm going across, and then I'm going to come down. I'm going to leave my rotary cutter there just so it's a marking spot. If you're confident doing that, great. If you're not confident doing that, put your rotary cutter down and then move your ruler. This just kind of helps it stay. And see, I got a little bit off, but that's okay. I'm going to move it that last little bit. And so I have, oops, see, I got a little bit of a sliver there. So I have my 12 3/4 tall by 17 inches wide. I need to cut it out of this brown fabric as well. So I know I have a registration cut on one side of this brown fabric. If I was using fabric that is printed and has a right side and a wrong side, solid cotton doesn't often have a right side and a wrong side. If I was using printed cotton though, I would place this square on top of this square, right sides together, so I can just leave them together as I am marking them and then sewing them. Okay, so I lined it across the top of my rectangle. Because I have this rectangle here already cut, it's a little bit easier to just cut a new rectangle, but I'm still going to use my lines to line things up because I still want it to be very square. And we're going to cut this last bit. Okay. So now I have two rectangles. Right sides together on top of each other. Now I have to draw my grid, and I know I'm doing 4 1/4 inch squares. So I'm just going to do a line. It doesn't have to be dark. These are just the cut lines to keep track of stuff and to help me have a grid on my fabric. Okay, I'm just going to rotate my fabric because it's easier to mark my grids up and down than side to side with the camera. So hopefully you can see this grid, but if I'm going to scroll in after I get everything marked so you can take a look at it. So remember, I am now going to do my diagonal lines. I do want to mark those so I can sew 1/4 inch to either side of diagonal lines. And I want to follow this pattern of starting in my bottom left corner. I'm going to make like a on point square and then point to point, continue that same pattern. And I say that because you want to keep track of how you're sewing. I did actually do my diamond pattern the very first time I did this wrong on these side ones because I had, let's see, I did on my first one, I did only 2 tall, but I did 5 wide. And so this 5th one is a half diamond. And I did that wrong, and so I did one right, but one wrong. It was kind of funny. So you want to follow, this is what we're doing here, this diamond pattern starting in this corner, and you're going to continue as tall as you have or as wide as you have those diamonds. So I guess I will need this ruler, and you're just going to go point to point. Once you get past that first one that is short, you can go across 2 squares at a time, just trying to make sure it lines up on the point there as well as possible. And then I know from my drawing, and because I want to mimic this side, I'm going to connect these 2, but I can continue all the way up and all the way down here. So let's get that aligned. And then I want to mimic this side to make that full square on point, but I'm going to continue all the way up again. So I like to put my pencil in that corner to kind of start, and then it's easier to kind of rock my ruler than it is to like fully align it without kind of like a registration point. I use that term a lot, but it's true. So we've continued those up, and we know we need to mimic these lines. So we are going to continue just making those on point squares. I would say diamonds, but they're actually really not diamonds. And our last one is this corner to mimic our first corner in a mirrored image. Okay, so you can see I have my grid all drawn out, my vertical and horizontal grid, and then my diagonal lines. So the diagonal lines are the only ones you're going to sew 1/4 inch away from each side. You could put a mark if you need to. So I'm gonna go sew a 1/4 inch here, back down here, here. I'm gonna come up here and I'm just gonna continue across. And then I'm gonna do the opposite sides after I get everything done. I did notice as I get larger fabric, it's helpful to pin it together a little bit. So I'm pinning on the horizontal vertical grid. Oops, I poked myself. Just because I'm not gonna sew over that. I'm only sewing on the diagonal lines. So this will help hold the fabric together and not shift. Okay, so let's go to the sewing machine and I will show you sewing along those lines and then we'll cut them all apart and you will see the magic. Okay, I am struggling a little bit with the light in my sewing room today. It's a dreary day, so I apologize. I'm hoping we can see this. I have my piece of fabric here and I have my diagonal lines. So I'm just going to start up here and sew a 1/4 inch to the side of the line. Something that could help is if you have a 1/4 inch guide that you could sew using that, or if you know based on your foot where a 1/4 inch is, just keep your foot that distance from the line. This is another reason making those squares slightly bigger can help if you really need to even add a full inch to your square size. I'm going to try to pull the camera in so we can see this a little bit better. Okay, I think this vantage point might help a little bit. You actually don't need to backstitch. I almost backstitched out of habit because we're going to be cutting all these apart, but getting the stitch length at a smaller stitch length is helpful. I like to keep it right around 2 for stuff like this where I'm cutting apart along the stitches or across the stitches. When I get to the edge, I'm just going to cut it. If I'm on the inside, I'm going to pivot with my needle down. As you can see, I am not really pulling or pushing my fabric through. I'm just having my hand here to guide it. I have a cutter on the foot of my machine. One of the great things about this Juki. Okay, so here when we come to an end, can you see here that I'm coming up to this straight grid line here, and I want to transition to come on the side of this angled line. So I'm going to stop at the line, put my needle down like it is, and pivot it to come along this edge. I'm going to now continue just down this line, and then I'm going to stop and pivot at my next horizontal vertical grid line. When I'm putting my foot back down, I'm just trying to make sure the foot is parallel to my drawn diagonal line. And I do have to kind of smooth out fabric because it's bunching up a little bit over here. So I'm still going to turn and pivot and do on the inside. So I'm going to pivot right on that line again. Just continuing until you have all of the seams sewn. Okay, I have sewn 1/4 of an inch away on every diagonal line, which is what we want. Now we're going to go back to the cutting table and we're going to cut them apart. So you can take out your pens, and you might have done that while you were sewing. Totally great too. So if you can see, we still have our drawn grid, and then we have our diagonal lines. We've sewed 1/4 inch away on either side of diagonal lines. So in theory, if you have an HST, before you open it up to trim it, this is where it's at on each section. Sometimes it really helps to see that visual. So what we're going to do, I like to cut the horizontal and vertical lines first personally, and then cut the diagonal lines, but you kind of want to leave everything where it's at as you're cutting. So you're going to align your ruler right on top of each of those vertical lines and cut them apart. And just leave them in place, lifting and being very careful as you're shifting your ruler. If you need to, again, you know, just kind of bump them back into place. We're going to cut this one. The horizontal lines. Okay, so now this is kind of what it would look like if you laid out all your HSTs that you sewed 2 at a time. It would probably look similar to this. But this is where the magic happens. Now we're going to cut on the marked lines, leaving everything in that nice laid out grid, being careful not to shift things. If your lines are a little bit off, the goal is to just go point to point. You could, after cutting all of these squares apart, take your squares and cut them apart just like regular HSTs as well. But you do not have to do that. Last one to cut. So now I have 24 HSTs. Oops, that one didn't quite cut through. Isn't that amazing? So 2 ways you can trim this down. I find it's faster to trim them before you fold them open by taking your ruler, and this really helps to have a ruler the size that you're cutting down to, and putting the point directly on top of the seam line, and then just trimming those 2 sides and trimming off the tails. I'll do it. I find that if your seam is not super straight, this can be not the most accurate. HST, we cut off those little tails because then when we open it up, there's no tails sticking out. The other way is to iron it open. Ironed. And then trim it down on all 4 sides that way. I love these Black Lock rulers, not a sponsor. they have a little bit of a lip that catches on the seam, and then you can butt it up nice and tight against that seam and trim on all 4 sides. I like to use my little rotating mat for this. Mine is a little warped, so it doesn't rotate the best, but it does help. So you can spin it if it's at an awkward angle to cut on one side. So there's our HST, and I have 23 more to trim down. Again, you can trim before it's unfolded, maybe slightly less accurate, but it's pretty darn close. Even if it's a little bit off, it's going to be less than a 1/16 of an inch, I think. So this is one that I trimmed before I opened it up, and this is the one I ironed and then trimmed. I like to iron to the dark side unless it calls for, you know, like this. If I iron both to the dark side, my seams aren't going to nest when I put them right sides together. So if I'm sewing like this, maybe I want to iron one to the light side and one to the dark side so the seams can nest. To recap, you can make however many HSTs at a time you want by drawing in a grid like this. And the squares of the grid should be the same size as if you are cutting and making 2 at a time HSTs. Roughly a 1/2 inch to 3/4 bigger than your cut size. That is the size you cut out or trim to. The finished size of a 3.5 inch HST is going to be a 3-inch finished HST. So I hope that helps and gives you a nice look at how to figure out how to make a lot of HSTs at one time for any size. So that's it. I watched a video from a Diary of a Quilter, and she was doing it specifically for her pattern with 5-inch squares, 16 at a time. That's what her pattern called for. I thought it was very awesome. This is a fun additional sewing skill that I hope you use or try out. Please let me know in the comments if you do.